Last week on Talk Africa, we asked whether democracy is truly working for Africa. Our panel explored its promise, its failures, and the frustrations of citizens across the continent. Let's now take a look at what some of our panelists had to say.
The ultimate test of any democratic culture is that governance responds to the aspirations of the people. Any system that does not allow that to happen, or any system that can be hijacked for that not to be happen, does not give us the dividend of democracy. And that is the biggest challenge we have. So whether hospitals are not working, services are not taking place, the question is who is accountable for that? Who is going to be forced to resign because their electoral promises were not delivered?
With the introduction of this idea of democracy itself, the ideals are not alien to Africa, like freedom and dignity, but the architecture, the delivery of that democracy and the state system does not really serve the material conditions of the people. Our continent is youngest in the world, average age around probably 19, and who is actually in power? Majority of people over 60 and above, without any notion of inclusion, proper inclusion, not just participation, but actually including young people's voices. We see young people stuck in education systems that have not been decolonized. We see people being trained for the jobs that don't exist.
Now this week, we take the conversation further and ask, if democracy in its current form is not delivering prosperity, is it time to rethink governance across Africa? Could there be alternative models better rooted in the continent's values, cultures, and modern realities? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, to help us explore these questions and imagine what a new governance model for Africa could be like, we're joined by a panel of experts. With me here in studio, Professor Macharia Munene, an expert in diplomacy, geopolitics, and foreign relations at the Horn Institute. Joining us from New York, also via Zoom, Professor David Monda, Professor of Political Science at City University of New York's Gutman Community College. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, via Zoom, Solomon Derso, Founding Director, Amani Africa. And from Johannesburg in South Africa, also via Zoom, Dr. Oscar Van Heiden, Senior Research Fellow, Center of African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. We're also joined by a live audience of students from the University of Nairobi. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. I want to get a comment from all of you panelists first, very briefly, because in 2024, around 20 national elections were held across different African countries. Yet even in places where ballots are regularly cast, citizens still question whether democracy is truly delivering. Now, a recent Brookings study shows that only 22 out of Africa's 54 countries are now considered democratically leaning, down from 31 in 2019. Now, the question is, and I'll start off with you, Dr. Van Heiden, is it time for Africa to start discussing alternatives to the current model of governance?
I do believe that there is room for such a conversation. Of course, as you know, because of our colonial past and the scramble for Africa and so on, it is thought that we obviously have to subscribe to a Western-style democracy, have elections every 5 years, and so on. And the form of government that we have opted for is very much in line with the Western model. But I do think that there is room for a conversation that says it's time that we do some introspection. We have a look at whether that has been the best model for us, and whether there is actually some African values and leadership that we can bring into the equation to begin to redefine what democracy should be for the continent.
Solomon?
The quest for an accountable, responsive system of governance is basically a popular demand. All African citizens would like to live in a country that had a government that's accountable to the people and responsive to their needs. We can give it any kind of name, whether it's Western-style democracy or any other form. The one thing that we have to be careful about when we have this kind of the conversation is not to blame the system for the failures of leaders and political actors. That we need to be very careful about. Of course, we have to also consider history and the constrained space, policy space within which Africans are forced to pursue the triple challenge of state building, nation building, and democratization, all at once, as opposed to the historical trajectory that was followed by the more advanced democracies where these things have been followed sequentially.
Professor Monda, your thought?
As my colleagues have mentioned, there is space and there's definitely a need for this conversation because democracy has to be retooled to the specific needs and context of each individual African country. And as we know, a lot of African countries are well advanced in terms of building their institutions towards democracy. There's those who are in transition, and of course there are those who are backsliding. However, I must add that we cannot get back to the kind of conversations we had in the 1960s when the founding fathers of many of our African countries got independence. Mm-hmm. They rejected liberal democratic ideals, and a lot of them decided to go on their own trajectories in terms of what they defined democracy to be. And that did not end very well, particularly in the 90s, with people's agitation for more freedoms and for multipartyism. So as much as we want to have this conversation, it can be hijacked by very specific cunning political players to justify their arbitrary neo-patrimonial tendencies and dictatorship proclivities in terms of how they see the state, to justify their injustices towards the majority of their people.
Right, Professor Macharia.
Well, I think we should be talking about governance. And governance is dynamic. And each people have to reevaluate how they are doing in terms of governing themselves. What they call a democracy or some other thing is not an issue. But people have to come together once in a while, maybe within a generation or two, and reassess how they are doing from what point to what point. There is no country in the world, as far as I know, which started as a democracy.
Right. So, Dr. Van Heerden, I want to get your perspective on this, because one of the foundations of democracy is that citizens have the power to choose their leaders through elections. And Professor Macharia has talked about the need for governance, really. The question here is, can citizens always be trusted, though, to vote in the right leaders?
You know, the people need to be trusted because the people know what their needs are. I agree with Solomon, it's about transparency and about responsiveness. And we need to allow people to make those choices. If we are dictatorial, if we dictate to them, that's usually when we run into problems. But having said that, at the same time, we need to be aware of populists and populism, because often the people want to pretend as if things are in black and white, but it is far more complex than that. But at the same time, I do think that we must trust the people. Remember, Beatrice, that there are some few indicators that is important. The one we are talking about right now is what is participation. People that participate in elections, they participate in civil society and so forth. And that is one measure of what and how democratic your society is. It's an important measure. The people are important and we need to trust them.
So, Solomon, we started off this conversation by talking about around 20 national elections were held in 2024. Are elections alone enough? And if elections alone are not enough, what else should matter in determining who becomes a leader in Africa?
I think it's obvious. Election is not the defining feature and the most important element of democracy. And if democracies are actually to be, determined, it is not just that procedural aspect, which happens in a cycle of 4 years or 5 years, that would, be the most important thing. What happens between those cycles is perhaps much more important than what happens during the casting of ballots by citizens. For democracy, particularly elections, to succeed, the following considerations are important. Professor Monda mentioned about the role of institutions. Particularly, he made reference to the electoral management bodies and the critical role that they play in terms of their impartiality and independence. But other institutions, such as the judiciary, which actually provide a forum for dispute settlement, for adjudicating electoral contestations when the candidates do not agree on the outcome of the election. Then instead of resorting to their own means for asserting or for finding corrections, they go to the judiciary. If you do not have an independent judiciary that is trusted by the parties and trusted by the public, then you would end up having a situation in which contestation over the outcome of elections may actually escalate into violence. And this happens in many contexts on the continent.
Right.
But beyond and above institutions, it's also important to think about the following issues. One is the question of vision and ideas and ideologies. If elections are not anchored around ideas, marketplace of ideas, and instead they become actually a platform for contestation of identities, then they would end up actually fragmenting the electorate into the different ethnic or religious or other sectoral cocoons, and thereby defeating the very idea that the people are sovereign. The other thing that is equally important is the question of ethical leadership. I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of this. In many of the instances in which the democracy has failed to deliver, is to be found in the failure of ethical leadership on the part of political elites on our continent.
Right. So, Professor Macharia, I do want to bring up the issue that Solomon has raised there on the issue of the ideologies and the marketplace of ideas. Do you think, though, that African politics revolves more around personalities as opposed to that marketplace of ideas or ideology?
The personalities matter, but we may need to go back to the beginnings, the anti-colonial period. What was it all about? It was simply anti-racism. And our leaders of the fight for independence simply wanted to replace a Mzungu with a black person. And we agreed with that. We thought it's a good idea. So at independence, the white governor left and a black president came in and his ministers, and they continued with the same institutions. There was very little discussion as to the direction that the new entity should go and how it should go. So there really was no serious discussion about the future. So the very few of the African countries did anything to re-examine what it is that they were inheriting, either because they were not able or they were not allowed. If they were not able, they needed some assistance. Second, Africa has been very unfortunate that we have had very bad people as leaders, people who do not use their common sense. Because some of the mistakes have been basic errors of common sense. And to the extent that our leaders, whom we trust in the first place, are not reliable, then we have a problem. The issue of democracy is neither here or there, because it is relative to the place, because for each people to say how they want to govern themselves. And if they are agreed, then they continue that way. So the ideology is really not the issue here.
Let me get that perspective as well from Professor Monda. Do you agree, though, that our politics revolves more around personalities than around issues?
I think I'd agree with that. It's less about ideologies, it's more about identities. And that has been very specifically crafted by political players. The fact that by and large on our continent, ethnicity, is a major tool for political mobilization. And this has really crippled the development of ideology and ideas which can be a long-term guide for the country once a lot of the leaders in power, are dead or long gone. And we see this, in the context of Kenya, for example, where every election cycle you have a new bucket of coalition parties and a new set of parties that are really briefcase parties. They're really very much driven by individuals that tend to dominate, that political space. But I also must add, at least in my own understanding, that democracy has certain fundamentals, fundamental yardsticks that you need to really be thinking about. Questions of accountability, legitimacy, civil society space, freedom of media, regular, free and fair elections, not just regular elections, but free and fair elections, and ultimately accountability. I think that bucket load of determinants is very important, even as we think about the different hybrid versions of how we understand democracy across the continent. But there's certain fundamentals that I think should go across the board, whether it's presidential systems, semi-presidential systems, parliamentary systems, or whatever other hybrid of democratic governance we decide to have on the continent.
All right, Dr. Van Heijden, as we talk about what African, governance revolves around, of course, the key question is then, how can policies and institutions be at the core of leadership as opposed to individuals, since we are hearing how much, African politics revolves around personalities?
I think, Beatrice, the point that Solomon is making, if I understand him correctly, is that it's a combination of these things. And it really boils down to leadership. If you look, for example, at the generation of Kwame Nkrumah, Kenneth Kaunda, and that generation, what Frans Fanon talks about in terms of it was really the idea of decolonization, moving post-colonial. How do we define ourselves, as the professor there next to you was alluding to? And then, of course, you take other personalities like Thabo Mbeki, Olusegun Obasanjo, Bouteflika, who then pushes ideas around African Renaissance and so forth, and give us a vision, something that we can aspire towards. I think those are important personalities and ideas, and then of course the giving credence to that, because remember, the Organization of African Unity came out of that post-colonial period that then transformed and morphed into the AU and the various institutions and so on of the AU that now is trying to give us a new purpose as the continent. So I think that personalities are important, but the ideas, the battle for ideas, is even more important. And that's really what I like about the discussion we're having today.
So let's look at some solutions now in this section. And let me come to you, Dr. Van Heijden. What might a hybrid model of governance look like? One that reflects African traditions, but also adapts to today's realities.
Firstly, the two key elements for me would be participatory democracy. In other words, we don't just leave everything in the hands of government. That requires us the second element, which is active citizenry. We need to be participating and be active citizens in the challenges that we are facing. The days of thinking that government is going to solve all our problems on our behalf is over. We need to become active in NGOs, CBOs, and so on and so forth. The hybrid model, I think, many African countries and governments are trying to promote social democracy, where they try and redistribute some of the wealth and the taxes to the poorest of the poor. It's not necessarily a model that is working 100%, but I do think that model plus active consultation with people. You know, here in South Africa, Beatrice, I'm sure you are aware, after 30 years of democracy, President Ramaphosa now wants to have a national dialogue. And I think the reason for this is because he realized, and his party realized, that it is time that they go back to the people and have a conversation about what is it that we are doing wrong, what can we improve on, what is it that you can do, labor, private sector, and so on. And I think that that kind of interaction with our people, Lokhotlas, Prof, you'll know what I'm talking about, even in the olden days, in the villages and sitting under the trees, consulting with our people and getting their input as to what best way we can move forward. I think that is a hybrid that I would be comfortable with.
So, Professor Macharia, which brings us to the question then, after all these years of indoctrination, 60 years for most African countries, can Africa innovate its own governance?
Yes, but it will need some serious rethinking. It needs to deal with the problem of interpreters. One of the main struggles that we are going through is who interprets Africa. And it's a struggle that goes all the way back to 1900, as to who decides what happens and what is thought and what is relevant to Africa. We do have right now some of our leaders, before they do anything serious, they consult somebody in Europe or in America. And that should stop. Because instead of consulting those people out there, they should be consulting their people, which does not happen very often. So it can be done, but the African peoples have to take charge of what is to be done.
Right.
The interpretation. It is terrible that some of our interpreters and those who tell us what should be done in Africa, in the interest of Africans, are not Africans. So we need to build a little bit trust on ourselves.
Right.
And that's why I was going back to the basics. Let every child get the best possible education and know the societies and the countries in which they live. Then they'll know what is the value. They'll know what to do once they get into positions of responsibility. They'll use common sense. Right now we have people who are not using common sense, and yet they are making policy. But it can be done.
Right, so I'm going to take some questions from members of the audience. Let's start off with you.
Hello, so my name is Martin Mutuku, a student at the University of Nairobi. So my question goes to Solomon, and in recent days we have seen demonstration and protest across the country in Kenya. This shows that people and the youth have already lost trust in the leaders, in the leaders and their leadership. So how can these leaders do in order to regain the trust of the youth in the country?
One of the things that leaders need to do is basically to abide by and respect and effectively follow the dictates of the Constitution. So living within the bounds of Constitution and respecting and advancing constitutionalism is important. They need also to create the space where citizens are actually able to speak and express their views and to put their demands, and governments need to respond to those demands honestly and genuinely. And trust is not something that you can easily gain. It has to be earned, and you can earn trust only through delivering on the promises that you made. For example, promises made during elections, promises made within the framework of advancing the interests of the public. And the challenge, of course, I think it's important that democracy doesn't depend on the goodness of leaders, and it shouldn't depend on the goodness of leaders. If anything, if it is based on individuals, then individuals have to be seen as fallible. That is why we need a system of governance. And we need to respect and advance the independence of constitutional institutions, from the judiciary to the Police Oversight Commission in Kenya, for example, to Parliament, to the Human Rights Commission, and so on and so forth. These institutions need to be respected, but also they need to have the space for which they are created for them to deliver on their mandate. I think Professor Macharia made a very important point. Actually, Frantz Fanon, in his renowned book, The Wretched of the Earth, warned that the elites of the independence time and the urban working class cannot be trusted for advancing the interest of the mass of the people, because their interest is aligned with the interest of the departing colonial powers. And the point that Professor Macharia made about leaders going and consulting foreign powers is indicative of the fact that the people are not sovereign.
All right, gentlemen, I want to get your final comments, and very briefly, if democracy in its current form is not working for some African countries, what possible alternatives should African countries explore? Very briefly, starting with you, Professor Macharia.
Well, go back to the drawing board with no particular mode in mind, and then have a consensus building. And get people who can be trusted. Because it does not matter what model or whatever you have. If you have the wrong people in the institutions, in the presidents, in the prime minister, whatever it is, if you have the wrong people, it will still not work. So find a way of getting people you can trust to get into those institutions, then it will work.
Right, Dr. Van Heerden?
I think that we need to accept, Beatrice, that there are different forms of democracy. For too long have we been trying to shove down the throats of Africans a Western-style democracy, and a notion that other practices elsewhere in the world is not acceptable. I think we need to look at all those models. We need to consult the people, the citizens, and then we decide on what is the best model for us. And as I've indicated, and many other of the panelists, as long as there's the key elements of transparency, of accountability, and of responsiveness, then I think we are on the right track.
Professor Monda, you have the final word.
I think we need to reimagine the role of Africans who are now subjects and reimagine how they can be citizens, you know, as Professor Mamdani talks about, right? That post-colonial, a lot of our citizens have become subjects. How do we reevaluate that? But also, finally, in Swahili, we have this saying that says, mtafutaji hachoki, right? He that seeks never tires. And I think it's important when you think about democracy, in spite of the pitfalls and the challenges, democracy is a journey, it's not an event. And I think we should be hopeful as we look towards reforming our continent to a brighter democratic future.
All right, and we are going to leave it on that bright note, and that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Professor Macharia Munene, an expert in diplomacy, geopolitics, and foreign relations at the Horn Institute. Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, Senior Research Fellow for the Center of African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Professor David Monda, Professor of Political Science at City University of New York's Gutman Community College. Solomon Derso, Founding Director, Amani Africa, and our live audience, students from the University of Nairobi. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.